Professor Gordon Lloyd, we thank you for all you do for constituting America, and we are so happy to have you here with us today.
Welcome. I'm happy to be here. Yes, I am. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, we are too. And we were hoping you might want to just give us a few opening comments on the concept of anarchy and the founders' thoughts as they were structuring our Constitution.
Well, the way I try to look at this is that on the one side of the coin is tyranny, and on the other side of the coin is anarchy. When you flip it, you never know how it would come down, except the framers hoped that it would come down on its side, so you would have neither tyranny nor anarchy. But that's the issue that just behind sort of the corner, if you think you've solved the problem of tyranny, then there's always anarchy to deal with, and vice versa. So the way in which you have introduced today's talk in terms of your head note from John Adams, that it's very interesting. The way in which he joins the two is sort of the status of private property. If private property is not sacred, then really it doesn't matter whether you fall into tyranny or anarchy. It's the same. It virtually is the same thing, because it means the loss of private property. So that's the way Adams puts it. I'm putting it similarly, but slightly differently. I think the way the framers looked on this is that they had to deal with the issue, which was popular among what is known as Whigs. Whigs and the Tories. The Tories were the conservatives and the monarchists. The Whigs, we don't need to get into how they derived that name, but they're opposite to Tories. And the Whig sort of mantra for liberty was as where annual elections end, tyranny begins. That is sort of the mantra. And therefore, a lot of American Whigs were concerned about governors being in office for too long, justices not being elected or not being capable of being removed, that sort of thing. So their solution, American Whig solution for tyranny, was regular elections, but particularly annual elections. Through this debate, I think that what Madison and others did was to sort of stretch it, that you could still have freedom if you have biannual elections or you have triannual elections. You don't have to have annual elections, but you do have to have elections, and you do need to have them frequently. But the problem is, if you have annual, then you introduce the problem of anarchy, because if there's annual election, there's so much turnover in office that the new crowd wants to get rid of the old laws practically before they've just sort of settled in. And that is the sort of an idea of anarchy, that it's a lack of the rule of law, a lack of the reliability. Adams puts it in terms of private property. I put it more in terms of the rule, for our purposes here, in terms of the rule of law. The rule of law is in danger from tyranny, and it's in danger from anarchy. And last week you heard about the dangers from tyranny, and this week we're going to talk about the dangers from anarchy. That's one sort of, I have 2 points to make, but that's my sort of my first point, that they're both sides, they go together. The issue of liberty with order has been extremely difficult to achieve, because it's usually meant order falls into tyranny and liberty falls into anarchy. So it's been extremely difficult. That's the challenge. How can I have both liberty and order and avoid, and that's the coin, how do I then stop it from flipping to tyranny or stop it from flipping to anarchy? Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, I think that is a phrase by Madison in Federalist 55, where he says, if every Athenian were a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still be a mob. Now, I'm using the word mob here. It could be used in the when you're talking about tyranny, and it can be used in when you're talking about anarchy. Let's talk about it in terms of anarchy, but I think that's what Madison was getting at here. It's these small assemblies, which has a certain appeal to the American tradition, decentralized, small communities who know each other, get together, anti-federalists, Brutus, all of that, which we've done before. You get to know each other, you know each other, and that's how you preserve liberty. Madison is saying, actually, getting together on the spot, like they used to do in Athens, requires a particular kind of shall we say, care in design. And it's not good enough to say, well, let's make every American a Socrates. Because if every Athenian were a Socrates, it would still be a mob, or we would still be facing the issue of anarchy. So that Madison would say, yes, we require a certain kind of public virtue, but it's not Socratic, which is not that kind of wisdom. It's practical wisdom, not theoretical wisdom. It's a wisdom that says that you learn from experience, you learn for the ages, and you learn to have an attachment without embarrassment to the country. And you learn how to be a citizen. You turn up to vote, you engage in discussions. So this is my second point. We don't have to be Socrates in order to make the American system work. In fact, Madison is saying, we certainly don't want to be all Socrates. It requires practical wisdom. And to make it work then is that you have to do something about the assemblies, and you have to do something about the individuals. So we're going to be virtuous, we're going to be caring, but we're not going to be Socratic caring. We're going to be, well, you just fill in the blank, founders caring. And that we don't want the assemblies which gather right on the spot in Athens, which you want representative government. But you don't have to have annual elections. You can have biannual, but that's the way this sort of representative government is the way Madison is going to suggest that we solve both tyranny and anarchy. And right now we're trying to solve the problem of anarchy, which I would say is mob rule. Tyranny is usually a monarch or an aristocrat bossing it over others. Mob rule, anarchy, is usually with a whole bunch of people involved. So how can we be both democratic and sensible and decent? Virtue in the people, but proper virtue, not Socratic virtue, and designing the Constitution in such a way, and this comes a challenge, that we filter in and out the good things, and we filter out the bad things from coming in the first place. I think I've said enough for you to think about.
Well, those are great opening comments to get us started. Thank you so much. And, I think in getting ready for this show, one of the things we did was we looked back through the Federalist Papers to see how many times the word anarchy was mentioned. And I think we came up with 16 different times that the word anarchy was mentioned in the Federalist Papers. And it seems like that the framers were making their case for the Constitution as opposed to the Articles of Confederation. One of their points was they felt that if we kept the Articles and did not adopt the Constitution, the country would fall into anarchy. Do you want to comment on that?
I think that's very insightful. Yeah, I think that Madison and Washington, certainly comes around 1787. We've had whether it's the Continental Congress operating under some kind of union, or the Articles of Confederation. We've had it going on now for 10 years, and there's a certain weakness in it. It's not a government. Well, that becomes the issue. Do you want to create one government over 13 colonies becoming states, which then means you're just an American, you're no longer a Virginian? Is that what you want to do? That's one solution for having a confederation which natural pull is towards the edges. I mean, in most organizations, there's a twofold pull. One to the center, which becomes centrifugal, or there's a pull to the outside, which is centripetal or centripetal. You can see the word petal. And so as far as Madison was concerned, the danger of the articles was it's centripetal, that it didn't have within itself the capacity to sustain. So there's going to be some kind of anarchy, breakdown, the ability for Rhode Island to break away or South Carolina to break away. There's no glue. So in one sense, the Federalist paper, let's just say half of the 16, one of them goes over about 4 pages. So I'm going to go with your 16, but it depends on how you break down those 4 pages. But the point is, so one danger of anarchy is that the union itself is going to fall apart. So you need a more perfect union. And that's sort of the preamble. So how do you create a more perfect union? Well, you have to create some glue. And then the danger, the anti-federalists are going to raise this, Bruce is going to say, is that now you've created a centrifugal tendency, a tendency to tyranny. So we're going back and forth. How centrifugal, how centripetal should we be? And that's a balancing act. That deals with the union. And let's say that deals with half of the issues that Madison raised about anarchy. The other half deals with the state governments themselves. If we go back to 1775, 1776, when independence was being pondered, shall we or shall we not? Shall we reconcile? Shall we not reconcile? Shall we petition? Oh, shall we beg on our knees? Shall we do this, that, and the other? Ultimately, if you're going to declare independence from Britain, you have to declare the establishment of some kind of union government, which we say is articles, and some kind of state governments. And when we think of the Declaration, usually we think of July the 4th and declaring away from Britain. But there are 2 sort of sub-declarations, or 3 sub-declarations. One is we're declaring we're going to be in this together in some form. 2, you're going to be independent on your own state and local level in some form. And 3, you're going to be at a situation whereby we can create alliances with France and Spain or whatever it is. So declaring independence is not just from King George, but because it holds implications in these 3 levels. Otherwise, you're going to have anarchy. If you separate from the tyranny of George and Parliament without setting up some form of state and local government and union government and creating alliances, then you're just living in an anarchy. I think what Madison and Washington were getting at is we've reached a point now where the peace has been, declaration has been declared, peace, war has been won, peace has been declared. Now, well, what do we do? And I think what Madison's point is, he's going to emphasize that there's danger within the articles themselves to go centripetal, fall apart, because there's no real glue there. Congress can only do those things that the articles expressly state they can do. That's no way to run a government, precisely because we don't want a government, we want a federation. Then at the state and local level, Madison is saying that the old Whig theory of annual elections is actually prevailing, and the legislative branch is becoming the most dominant. We need to tweak that, because what we have is a whole bunch of laws, too many laws being made, too many contradictory laws being made, and what is the point of government except to bring some sort of stability along with liberty?
Well, I love that. I love the sub-declarations of the Declaration and how they kept us from devolving into anarchy once we made the Declaration. I'd never thought of it that way before.
And it's a regular challenge.
It is. It is. And I know Tova has got some brilliant questions lined up. So Tova, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Much, Kathy. So Professor Lloyd, you were talking about how we can emphasize real virtue in people as a way to combat anarchy, in contrast to Socratic virtue. Could you talk more about what the difference is between real virtue and Socratic virtue?
Socratic virtue requires a love of the truth, a life almost like a monk. You're not particularly interested in liberty as your highest goal or value. So if you take a look at Plato's Republic, where Socrates is the hero, and the republic that is created is called the best regime. Liberty is not central to that best regime. So what the founders had to deal with is to come up with a different kind of virtue, a virtue that was consistent with liberty. And Socratic virtue is consistent with the philosophical life, but it is not necessarily consistent with the life of a decent, sensible citizen, raising a family, obeying the law, going about business, loving country, etc. You need a different kind of virtue, which isn't Socratic. So where does that come from? Well, I think there are a variety of sources at the founding, some of which have been eroded over the last 200 years or so, and some new ones which have emerged. And I think the most important of all of those is self-reliance. That this is not a nation built for beggars. This is a nation built for people who want to be free. Free of what? Free from the domination by a king, tyranny, but also free from the fear of anarchy, and that the mob is going to be coming any time. That's what Adams means by private property being sacred. It has to be sacred from the king and a mob. So respect for private property, respect for education, respect for family, associations with others through church, through unions, through clubs, schools, etc., so that one becomes self-reliant, not in a sense of I'm, devil take the hindmost, or I'm just me, but it's a sort of a self-interest rightly understood, as Alex de Tocqueville used to say. It's not selfishness, but it's by helping others I help myself. So it's much more of a this worldly kind of virtue than a Socratic virtue, which is a dedication in effect to ideas and abstract things. And you don't ask. He'd ask Socrates, so what are you going to do with that one? What is that good for? He's going to look at you and say, well, then you don't really understand Socratic virtue. It's good in and of itself that I'm a monk or a scholar or whatever it is. Why did you ask me for what practical use it has to be? But I think the practical virtues is what's going to help. And some of them have been eroded, and some now we have more. I think I'm more optimistic than others with regard to the ability to have self-reliance through computers, for example. For example, this whole constituting America that we're doing today, I don't think could take place with Socratic virtue. It requires the care of donors. It requires the care of students. It requires the ability of organizing, and it requires Zoom.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. And then I was wondering, when we talk about these ideas of tyranny and anarchy, what would you say differentiates? Like, I think the word tyranny, for example, is like can be kind of a nebulous term that people might just apply to, people they disagree with politically. So yeah. What would you say separates, maybe a strong or more authoritarian leader from, tyranny? Like, we need to change this. And then on the other end, what separates maybe a more decentralized system or more not mob rule, but more, democratic means from anarchy? Is there any criteria you use?
Well, I think the criteria is what kind of political and social system you found in the first place. If you're not going to rely on experience anymore, which the Americans suggested that experience had gone a bit sour, so you're going to pick and choose from the experience. So now you have to set off for your own adventure, and with your own ship, and there's going to be flounderings, and you're going to learn from what goes on. But I think the most important one that Madison would teach us is, and it's very, very hard. I'm going to give you this because I think it's one of the hardest things that I've had to answer. Do you go to a small school or do you go to a large university? If you go to a small school, you have the opportunity to know each other, maybe join a sorority or a group of some kind. You have the college experience. You live in the dorm, you live off the dorm, but you get to know each other. And a lot within that experience, a lot of people marry each other eventually. And that's what I would call the small republic, or the small community that fosters interconnections. All right. And going back to our Federalist, anti-Federalist, that would be a Brutus model. That would be an old Whig model. Getting to know you kind of model. And Madison is going to say, yeah, but every time you leave your dorm room, somebody's going to know. And they're going to say, aha, I wonder where she's going to shop and what she's going to buy, because the shop is going to be real close. Everything is real close and real family. And Madison is saying, but you know what? That is precisely what the problem of anarchy is. It's sort of a small tyranny. That is, it's compliance. It's so that if you start to deviate in any way, they're coming after you. So that's one, I think, real test, that there's an attraction to small communities and decentralized living. You know your neighbor. But Madison's point in 1787 is, all right, we've tried that. And what we're finding is a lot of bad laws being passed, too many laws being passed, too much snooping going on. So now you may say, well, what's anarchistic about that? Well, it means that the rule of law is being changed all the time. Private property is not sacred, to use Adams. But by the way, if you want to understand what one of America's contributions to sort of how come you don't fall forward into tyranny or backward into anarchy, it is what Adams has said: private property. But the utmost private property is not material goods, it's your mind, it's your conscience. And so that is, I think, the key. And if those can be kept, those kinds of self-reliance, broadly understood, not meaning self in a very narrow sense, or reliance in the sense of being, I don't need anybody whatsoever. I'm a Superman or whatever, but in a common sense virtue way. But what is virtue? It means a certain spirit of, and virtue is important to a republic because republic is public things. Res means things, and monarchy, archy is rule, and mono is in that sense monopoly. So it's ruled by one. So a republic requires a certain regard for others. A free republic requires a certain regard for oneself. How do you pull that off? And Madison is saying the smaller the community, the harder it is to pull it off, because you're going to get this. You get this knowing you too much. I know too much about you, so that it's not healthy. So Madison wants to spread people out.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I was reading a book called The Goodness Paradox. It was like an evolutionary psychology book, but it was kind of talking about that idea of people who live in smaller communities, like more hunter-gatherer communities.
Yeah.
They have what you were saying, that the author called it tyranny of the cousins, where it wasn't like a government that was controlling them. They actually had very democratic norms, very informal political customs, but because it was so tight knit, everyone knew each other, and stepping even slightly out of line could lead to like banishment, or even more democratic, smaller hunter-gatherer communities actually had much higher rates of executions than more developed or more centralized societies, because the social norms were just that important, and people who stepped out of line faced
Yep.
much swifter punishment. So I thought that was an interesting
What it
parallel.
is, and you've described it in a minute. And if you have to look for a word, you have to ponder, do I choose the word anarchy to describe that? Or do I choose the word tyranny to describe that? And really, in the end, does it matter whether I choose the word anarchy or tyranny? Or is it more important that I give the description that you gave? And my answer would be, it's more important that you give the description, because you're telling people what the problem is.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes terms can only go so far. But I was curious, as you were mentioning America, it seems that, or just all over the world, social bonds kind of get more loose compared to before, where our country is getting bigger. People might not be as close with their neighbors, or there's just more going on. We're able to travel larger distances. So how do you think this kind of lessening of social connection affects which direction our country is moving towards, anarchy or tyranny?
Very good question. And I think that the direction is both. That there is going to, and I'm not ducking your question. I'm saying it's a very good question. And part of the difficulty is that, as Tocqueville pointed out, the more isolated you become as a community, the more likely it is that each of you don't have things in common anymore, except for one ruler. Thus, it can clearly lead to tyranny. That is, that what we have in common is this tyrant holds us together. That's the glue, rather than what we did before. All right. So on the other hand, however, what's to stop that breakdown from continuing to be another breakdown, another breakdown? And so what we've seen in the history of the world, let's just say the last 200 years, we've seen attempts, we've seen, the problem is that we don't have a united front, or we don't have a united policy towards this thing. All right, so we create United Nations, or we create the European Union. Okay, well, what happens when we do that? Well, we feel stifled, so therefore we want to break away and be able to be our own identity, our own. And this, I don't think this is going to go away. Whether we call it tyranny or anarchy, the phenomena that you took the time to describe is not going to go away. I don't think, because human nature being what it is. Now, you could hope that human nature is going to be different. And we're only tyrants because of our circumstance, or only anarchists because of our circumstance. But tyranny and anarchy are built into the human condition. And therefore, what it requires through family and private organizations, including the church, churches and private organizations, including schools and constituting America, etc., is to build that sense of communal importance without negating liberty. So it's an ongoing task. You just can't sort of wave a wand. One cannot wave a wand. I didn't mean you. One cannot wave a wand and say, all it takes is to change human nature. Well, good luck.
Yes, good luck indeed. And then my last question is, could you provide just a real world example that the founding fathers may have looked towards when they were developing their ideas of anarchy and tyranny? Like what real world examples were they thinking of for these systems? Because I guess the ones I think of are are more modern or may have happened
Yeah.
after the founding?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of if it was the tyranny, it would be the tyranny of the British Empire and not permitting Americans to be British. And so that in the American founding mind means that, that we have to create, excuse me, a separate identity, an American identity. And one of the issues I've been trying to deal with is when is it really seriously possible to say there is an American mind that is emerging? I mean, there's a colonial mind, 1620s, 70s. And so I think one way in which I answer the question of what models they look to for tyranny would be the British Empire itself, in which it became clear that they were no longer British, but they became American. And what does it mean then to be an American rather than British? And here's for me is the key. 1688 is where King James was kicked off the throne or invited to go to France and other places. And William and Mary of Orange, Mary's was James II's daughter, and William was the Protestant in Holland. They were invited to come to and be king and queen, subject to control of Parliament and subject to a Bill of Rights, which we get the English Bill of Rights. Okay, all of that is a good model as to how to reform the monarchy. But what it does is to tell me that the British had a right to restrain monarchy. It didn't have a right to do away with the monarchy. What the Declaration of Independence is saying is the only way to have a good monarch is to have no monarch at all. So that's one answer to your question about what do you do with tyranny, where the examples would come from. The immediate example is the British monarchy with Parliament itself. You have to change the whole form of government. How do you deal with anarchy? Well, one of the experiences that they had in terms of the colonial model was that their counterparts in Britain didn't have really good, solid representation. So you need to have districts drawn in such a way that you have fairly equal population to be represented, so that you don't have the encouragement to have mob rule and riots, etc., and have food riots and all of that. So I think that the British model is the most immediate model for the framers in terms of both tyranny and anarchy. You can go back. I've always been amazed at how little Greece really stood out in the discussions in between Federalists, anti-Federalists, what is going to be. There was all Roman, Publius Brutus, Cassius, etc. Why? Because Athens actually had a bad reputation, not only because it killed Socrates, but because it was a pure democracy. That is democracy on the spot. So that the two models that I think one could deal with is the model of the tyrannical king supported by Parliament on the one hand, and the anarchistic mob rule model of ancient Athens, where they gathered on the spot and made decisions right away. And is there a way in which you could sort of create a government that is neither Athenian nor British? The answer is, well, we think we have representative government. But how about at the interstate level? That becomes a real trick for in 1787 with the creation of the Constitution, because a lot of people then, as it is now, are attached to their state and local communities. And if you become attached to a union, it becomes, oh, I'm being really attached to Washington, D.C. and attached to what they say, and therefore I'm off on the road to tyranny again. I think you have to keep all of these things alive.
Thank you so much, Professor Lloyd. You're just a fountain of wisdom, and you always contribute so much. And now I would like to pass on to Jewel.
Hello again, Professor. Nice to see you and hear you.
Likewise, I haven't seen you in a couple months there, but a few months.
So, as far as our own revolution,
yes,
we did seek to eventually establish another government, but was the active revolution itself anarchistic?
In a sense, I mean, if our two choices at the moment are anarchy or tyranny, the answer is anarchy. Yes, it was anarchy to replace tyranny, which is why Adams and others right at the time when the Congress is declaring independence, it is simultaneously, I mean, right at the very same day, it is preparing for each colony to become a state and to set up such government, because they wouldn't, a little bit of anarchy is all right, but having anarchy in 13 colonies, not knowing what they're doing. So you're absolutely correct. And again, simultaneously, right away, they decided to set up the Articles of Confederation. Now that took longer because there was no experience, I mean, serious experience with intercolonial relationships, except on an emergency basis. So that took a lot longer. So after the Declaration of Independence, between 1776 and 1780, you have a robust, quick abandonment of colonialism on the local level and the creation of Republican government, particularly Whig, with tyranny, where annual elections end, tyranny begins. And then at the interstate, intercolonial level, it takes from 1776 all the way through to 1781. That takes 5 years to create an interstate government on which it's very clear that the government can only do those things which are clearly stated. It's not based on population, it's based on each state one vote. So that means a completely different way of organizing. And so you might say there's much more danger of tyranny coming out of the local level than anarchy, in a sense. And there's much more danger of anarchy taking place at the intercontinental level than tyranny. You can't be a tyrant unless you virtually have unlimited power. And the Articles did not they granted very few power. There's no power to tax. You can't tax, you can't tyrannize.
It's funny that they had to be, like you said, a little anarchistic, a little bit of anarchy. Question, and then was there any did anarchy have any intellectual influence at the time? Like, was there anyone pushing for let's just have no government? Was there any influence of anarchy?
If anarchy is defined as no government, I don't think that there was no name of prominence or influence, something like that comes. In fact, no name comes at all to mind in terms of no government at all. No, there was an understanding that government was needed. The question is, how limited shall it be? How robust shall it be? Shall it emphasize on health? Shall it emphasize on policing? So that's the debate. It's not between no government and all government. It was a debating on this fine tuning of, well, we can rely on ourselves for certain things, but we need government for things that we cannot do alone or do well alone.
And do you think it's funny because you could see anarchists or communists having the same flaw of not understanding or denying human nature. So both would think that that within the right system we can almost cure man of his ills in a way, and we can live in a and that would somehow be better than, what we have.
Your follow-up question encourages me to go back to your first question and refine a bit the idea that the framers may have been anarchists for a brief moment. They were certainly willing to entertain an abandonment of the existing system. Now, if that's anarchy, then yes. But you introduced in your second question a deeper understanding of anarchy. That is a request for no government at all. So, and if that's the definition of anarchy we're using, no, the framers weren't anarchists. If we're using the idea of an appeal to something, see, they have to appeal to something outside the system in order to challenge the legitimacy of the system. What did they appeal to? Things that we don't, it's very difficult for people to take seriously these days. It's called the laws of nature, nature's God. That there is an appeal not to tradition, because tradition wouldn't give it to you. As we were speaking just earlier, I mean, you can't turn to Rome, you can't turn, so what do you appeal to? Something called nature. That's Locke, that's etc. So in a sense, yes. Right? So yeah, it's anarchy, but not anarchy in, when you get to the 19th century understanding of the anarchists and the communists, they're really political. They just get in your face and want to make life miserable. So as soon as you start settling down, they're going to disrupt the system, because that's the only way. Because before all else, Marx was a revolutionist. And in the end, he sees the history unfolding so that in the end, there is no government at all. We just pick flowers in the morning, we chat at night, and we play dominoes in the afternoon or whatever it is, and fish. But that part of, that's 19th century to early 20th century kind of left-wing critique of government, which is still.
But I think it's so strange is that it's the left-wing critique of government, and you learn that it goes that anarchy is on the other side of communism, and yet in practice, the communist government believes it has the right to do anything. So it believes in practice it has the right, that there are no individual rights, but anarchy is considered not just that there's no government, but that the rights of the individual stand above all else. And so therefore there can be no government above the individual. And yet communism enacts the antithesis of that. The individual comes secondary to the community. But then, like what you just said, but yet the philosophical end of Marxism is no government at all.
That's
so
right.
It's like it's
right. Because the purpose of government for Marx is for one class to oppress another class. So if you get rid of classes, there's no need for government. So that we're no longer proletariat, we're no longer bourgeoisie, we're just individuals now without attachment to class. Marx starts with an attachment to class. Whether you are an old Whig or a new Whig, if you're part of the Whiggish of 1776 is an attachment to the individual. And that then becomes the question, is the individual everything, so you become like on the road to anarchy, or is the individual nothing except within a larger community, and then you're on the road to tyranny? But I think what we take as like a fairy tale, they took as a very serious proposition, that all men are created equal. And by that, they meant that none of us are born to be a serf for life. But born because just because I pop out of my mother's womb and she was a serf doesn't automatically make me a serf. Now, under the existing law, I might in fact be a serf, but just because it's been around for so long doesn't mean it's right. So you're coming up, some would call it a fairy tale, others would call it, like me, I would call it a different understanding of right and wrong, a non-traditional understanding that still needs to be worked out because it's novel.
What would you say to there's maybe one popular anarchist today. That's about all I could think of. It's a commentator named Michael Malus, and he'll speak about, he'll challenge the systems by saying things, the questions that really we don't hear often. And it's compelling because he's a good speaker and because people haven't considered those things before, and he comes at it from more right than left. But also, again, he does not have a Christian worldview. He doesn't see nature's God and nature's law as governing human nature. So if you think about, so let me make the question. If anarchy comes down to individual liberty, then you've already said that the government, that one of the keystones is property, is the ability to protect private property, that anarchy wouldn't provide that.
No.
How would you talk? And I think that's extremely compelling. And I think that the whole concept of property is something that when you talk to somebody, it can be made very compelling. But how? And how would you explain that? Maybe if you didn't have very long, you very short to try to make the compelling case to understand that many of our rights, why it was life, liberty, and property, and just pursuit of happiness now, but why was property important?
Because I think the framers had a view of human improvement. The project, the human project, is to improve one's condition. John Locke, God gave the world to man in common, but he didn't give it to them to lay waste and do nothing with. He made it for their own advancement and human improvement. I'm trying to shove my cat away as I'm talking to you. He insists. I don't know. I was talking yesterday. What do cats do before you had laptop computers? Chances when they play the piano. Where were we now about this?
John Locke, property.
John Locke, right. John Locke, and that's where Adams is coming from also, the idea of the sanctity of private property. And the idea is that we cannot improve ourselves unless we have the means to do precisely that. And that means that as long as we can claim that we work for it, this, I think, is the strongest case and also the greatest challenge for what we may call the democratic Republican understanding, the American understanding of the case for liberty and property. And that is, it's mine because I earned it. I worked for it. Now that's different than the feudalism system. I own it because my daddy owned it. It doesn't matter whether I'm good at what I do. It's just because of my position in life. I am the first male born, whatever it is. Therefore, I'm entitled to it. What the founding is introducing is this concept of not I'm entitled to it because of my birth and inheritance, but I have inherent rights, not entitled rights. So my inherent rights, rather than inherited rights, my inherent is that I have a right to life, and therefore I must have the right to the means to life as long as I use those means properly and don't hurt others in that use. So that the sanctity of private property is linked to the idea that that I have an obligation and I have a right to improve myself. So that the Locke understanding, which I think they inherited and made their own, is America is not a country made for beggars. Like Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, he says, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. And I'm gonna have to get this right. That you get your bread, your beer, and your beef. But because you say, this is what I can do for you, and the butcher, okay, and this is what I can do for you. Exchange. But you have to have the sort of the knowledge to exchange, and you have to be in a political system or social system which embraces exchange. As he says, as Smith would say, have you ever seen two greyhound dogs go down the street and sit down and have a little discussion and say, today you should have this bone, tomorrow That bone will be mine. Human beings are the only animals on earth who are capable of exchanging. So whatever, even if rare at the beginning, we grant that anarchy. Somebody's laughing at you. If you get
Yep.
if you're smashing a car, if in the beginning there were anarchists. Their justification was not anarchy for anarchy's sake, but rather we're going to overthrow the existing arrangements because it is right to overthrow it, and we will replace it with something that is right. We're not going to just replace it with another form of anarchy. So it wasn't, I want to correct what I said in your first question. It's not, it's not that they were simply pure anarchists. They were declaring a different system based on a different set of principles.
Thank you, Professor. And might have some audience questions to get to, but certainly a pleasure. And it was really fun to talk about anarchy for the first time on this show like this.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jewel and Tova, for your great questions, as always. And in mentioning Adam Smith, and we put a link to our archives in the chat a little earlier, we had a great episode or two on Adam Smith if people want to go back and watch it, because it was a fascinating podcast that we did a few months ago on that. But Professor Lloyd, you've got some fans who are watching. Joyce McLean says, this is so interesting. And John Chambers said, love the side of the coin analogy. I will use it. And one of our listeners asked about the present day. He wondered if we could discuss for a minute our anarchy and the current situation in Portland. Are we seeing anarchy in some of our American cities today, do you think?
Oh, well, yeah, I think, yes. I think we're seeing more anarchy than tyranny. I mean, there's certainly bureaucratic rules you have to go through, the environmental laws, and then you can't build a house, you can't do such and such, and this, that, and yeah. That's not anarchy. That's a sort of a layer upon layer upon layer, however they want to justify it. Anarchy is where, as Adams would say, private property is not held sacred. Private property is held as if it's a privilege, that I didn't work for it. It's a fairy tale that I own it. And I think that's one of the great strengths of that argument. It's mine because I earned it. And one of the great weaknesses is how then do I pass it on to my children who didn't earn it at all. They just happened to be my children, and I gave it to them. So I think what is going on is a bunch of, in part, spoiled brats who are taking because they think that keeping, it is not sacred, it is just privilege. And we're in a system where we're not supposed to revere or respect privilege. So I think when one says, I get disturbed about seeing a security guard and a supermarket, and somebody just takes cans off the shelf and puts it in a bag and wheels it out and says hi and bye, and nobody does anything. It's not worth doing anything because it's under $1,000, or maybe it's under 2,000. Why bother? That is bringing. That's not tyranny. That's anarchy. That's where there is no. You don't provide anybody any reason to remind them that we have laws to protect property, because actually I work for it. And a lot of the people whose property being lost are precisely the kind of people who come in. It's not your top Walmarts or your Buffett. It's your hardworking Korean immigrant. It's your hardworking small person who, starting a small business in itself is it's sort of dangerous. And a whole bunch of them go out of business very quickly. So I do think it's anarchistic when people want to work for a living. They try to work for a living. They don't want to be beggars. And what happens is that that work is being destroyed. And we're not doing much about it other than to say, well, so what?
Well, and we could probably talk a lot more about that for sure, but we are right at the top of our hour. And we thank you so much for being with us. You're just John's Chambers said that you're just a font of wisdom and information, and I agree. We all learned so much, and we want to thank you for your time. And Tova, Jewel, any closing comments that you'd like to give?
Thank you so much for being on, and have a great day.
The same to you, madam.
Thank you. Appreciate it again, Professor.
Good to see you again. Give my best to your brother.
I will.
And we want to thank our audience for joining us, and ask you to join us next week for Avoiding the Pitfalls of Partisanship, which should be very interesting, with Professor Morrissey from Hillsdale. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.